The next aspect I want to talk about are the differences in the vertebrae. So we have three general classes of vertebrae. We have the cervical, which are basically these three here. We'll talk about them individually. We have 7 total of those. We have our thoracic vertebrae, which are the ones that are going to be at about our rib cage. We're going to have 12 of those, and we're going to have the lumbar vertebrae, which are going to be in the lower back, and then we're going to have 5 of those. The other parts that we're going to also have are the sacrum and the coccyx, which I'll show kind of toward the end of all of this. So first thing that we want to focus on are the cervical vertebrae. And so I'm going to look at these 3 individually here. And the first thing I want you to notice when I pick up all 3 of them is you will notice 3 holes. And when I say 3 holes, I'm not talking about this one here. This is not a hole, but there's one here, there's one here, there's a big one here. On this one, same thing, 1, 2, 3. And on this one, same thing, 1, 2, 3. So on the cervical vertebrae, all of them have 3 holes. If we look at the thoracic and we look at the lumbar, they only have 1. So as long as you're seeing 3 holes, it's going to be some type of cervical vertebrae. So the thing is, because our cervical vertebrae are going to articulate with our head, the first 2 are going to be slightly different. And the big difference is just kind of the way that they're shaped. So once again, these 2 are our first 2, and they are what is known as C1, C1 referring to cervical vertebrae 1, and C2, which is cervical vertebrae 2. They have specific names, the atlas and the axis. And it kind of makes sense because T comes before X in the alphabet. So when we're looking at these, I want you guys to think of this area here, this area here, this area here, kind of as a head to a certain extent. It's known as the body of the vertebrae, but the reason I'm going to call them a head is because the heads and the tails or the necks look slightly different. So when we're talking about the tails, we're talking about these structures here called the spinous process. So if you run your finger down somebody's spine, these are the areas that you're actually feeling. So on C1, you'll actually notice that this guy doesn't have one of those spinous processes, one of those necks or one of those little tails. And the body is kind of missing. So that's kind of the big thing about the atlas, is the atlas doesn't really have that spinous process. It doesn't have a body in the center. It's kind of got weight distribution over here. With the axis is slightly different. Pictures don't do it justice, but if you kind of turn it on its side, you're going to notice that there's this piece up here that's projecting upward. And if you turn the other ones on their sides, they don't have that piece. So this piece here is the dens. And what it does is it allows the atlas to sit on the axis, and it allows you to basically turn your head left and right, up and down. It allows you to pivot on that joint. The third vertebrae that we have are typical cervical vertebrae. So any vertebrae, any cervical vertebrae 3 through 7 is going to look like this. And once again, they've got the 3 holes. They've got your typical body, and they've got this spinous process. Usually that spinous process actually splits into 2. So you'll notice that it kind of splits into 2 different pieces here. So that's our typical cervical vertebrae. Our next type of vertebrae are our thoracic vertebrae. So remember, thoracic vertebrae, they only have 1 hole. Lumbar vertebrae also have only 1 hole. The big thing here is, what does it look like? With the thoracic vertebrae, it actually looks like a giraffe. So if you think about the ears here, the horns, and that long neck, and it's that kind of long pointed neck, where the lumbar vertebrae, when you turn it on its side, you'll notice that it doesn't have that neck that kind of looks like a giraffe. This guy looks more like a moose. So once again, you got the ears, you got the horns up top, and then you've got the very, very thick neck. The other thing is, when you look at the size of these, okay, if you're talking about the middle of your back versus lower back, your lower back is holding a lot more weight. So the thoracic vertebrae also, or the lumbar vertebrae also tend to be much larger. The last of our vertebrae are going to come together and form what most people know as the sacrum and the tailbone. So this is just kind of showing you a model that shows how this actually occurs. So here we've got our lumbar vertebrae, and then we've got our sacrum and our coccyx. So our sacrum and our coccyx, we can actually divide them into 2 pieces, but the sacrum itself is basically 5 fused vertebrae. So when we look at it, you'll notice the holes. So we have 5 vertebrae that may have been separate at one point, but they've all been fused together. And then the coccyx here is going to be another set of fused vertebrae. This is known as your tailbone. So when they talk about your tailbone, this is your tailbone. And it can vary between 3 and 5 fused pairs. And usually when we look at the models have 4. So if we count this, 1, 2, 3, 4. So once again, your sacrum and your coccyx, they usually appear together and they're part of that vertebrae.